Prime Minister to present the case for the government.
Iranian women get their assertions of themselves thrown back in their face in the most violent way imaginable. This policy is a unique opportunity to reassert that self, that identity. We stand proudly in opening opposition. We stand for this policy alone rather than general endorsement of other Sharia principles, but we think this liberates women who have faced the most horrific oppression that they could otherwise never recover from. 2 points in this speech. Firstly, how retributive punishment is the only bulwark against instrumentalising these women for the sake of state aims, and secondly, how this policy is crucial for gender empowerment in Iran under Sharia law. So firstly, the principle of retributive punishment. An acid attack is as far from a victimless crime as you can imagine. It is firstly an attack on your personhood. It is a physical impairment that remains with you forever. To have that thrown in your face is something you never escape. Each day you look in the mirror, you have a reminder of that suffering, of that pain that has been inflicted on you. But secondly, and even more fundamentally, it is an attack on your identity. It is on how you interact with your religion that has been condemned by this acid being thrown in your face, by a family member, by a friend, by an acquaintance or a community leader. It is fundamental to how you view the world, the way you interact with your religion. To be punished in such a violent and visceral way is an attack on that religious freedom itself. It's also an attack on how you live your life as a woman, who you love, how you dress, the way you go about your life in the street. We think to be attacked for these things is to attack something far more fundamental than simply your skin. It is to attack who you are. So not only you remember this forever, because of the permanence, everyone you ever interact with will remember this suffering. This isn't something women can move on from unless they are re-empowered in a crucial way. The mental scars will track the physical scars when everyone responds physically, when they look aghast when they see you in the street. So in the context of this, retribution is the only way to restore agency to those who have had it taken away from them so violently. Because the right to inflict the same punishment on the one who inflicted it on you is crucial. Why? Because firstly, it may not fix the attack in terms of fixing your face, but it is an approximation of the suffering that we are placing back in the hands of the victim. This has to be a significant choice, because for these women to be able to choose to re-inflict that, they firstly have the recognition of the state that this crime was committed. Secondly, they are told that they are valued and this attack itself was wrong, an attack on who they are, and that actual agency is respected. But thirdly, the choice to either punish or forgive is placed in their hands. We don't mind which of these choices individual women take, but the key thing is that moral decision has to be a major one. Because if it is the decision as to how many years in prison they get, we think that doesn't re-empower the exact moral agency that was taken away. It is the supremacy of the attack, the heightened nature of the violence that was inflicted, which means the retaliation has to be just as violent. Any alternative punishment you could imagine under Sharia law or otherwise will be state instrumentalisation of these women for their own aims. Why? Firstly, because we think that it is arbitrary that you were the one who was attacked for these things. These women haven't violated laws, but as a result of personal feuds or other people taking the opinion that they have violated religion, they have had this suffering inflicted on them. If it's laws they violated, they're punished by the state. But the acid attack itself is arbitrary in the sense that the particular friend of yours, a particular family member, chose to throw acid on you rather than that happening to someone else. For the state to then take the punishment out of your hands, for them to say, we have a deterrent to achieve, or we have rehabilitation as an aim, we think is for the state to arbitrarily use you as a weapon in their fight against the crime that they're worried about, or in their fight against any other state policy that they want to achieve. But note also, the state can achieve their aims in other ways. If they want a deterrent, they can impose prison sentences for various crimes. But this mechanism is crucial, because if you don't do this, if you don't put this power back in women's hands, then we think the Iranian state itself is using those women to achieve its ends. That on its own is something that we cannot stand for. We support this policy simply for that reason. Second argument, why it is crucial for gender empowerment under Sharia law. When you are treated under a set of principles, when you live under Sharia law as an Iranian woman, you must apply those principles consistently. Why? Because we think when you live under the state, one of the most coercive institutions imaginable, when you live under the threat of jail or punishment under exactly this eye for an eye reciprocity principle, it must be applied in all areas of life. That is the premise of the society you're operating in. If you hit your husband, he can hit you back under Sharia law. We think equally if you are subject to an acid attack, you should have that right. We are neutral on the validity of different religions, but when they are applied, we say they must be applied consistently, otherwise in this case it is women who are disempowered. I'll take a POI from anyone who does not.
Aren't you going to reinforce a load of other Sharia values and systems that are much more persecutive towards women in general?
Firstly, in Iran, all the persecutive systems towards women are literally already implemented. We don't think we're reinforcing them at all. They clearly haven't pictured what Iran looks like if they think that all the ones that are bad to women aren't being implemented, but this one that might give women back some more power is the only one on the table. We think that is delusional. But furthermore, this is a policy about supporting a specific part of Sharia law. That's what we stand for in re-empowering women in this case. So, the status of women has been historically powerless under Sharia law. We think they've been subjugated by this culture, as that POI highlights. A number of elements of the laws are negative towards women. Therefore, to deny women this response, to deny them this freedom, which should be protected by their own value system, is the ultimate subjugation. It goes beyond stating religious freedom and Sharia should be able to set its own values, because it is state discrimination not applying that consistently in a way such that it benefits men when it's suitable to them, but isn't applied when it's actually bolstering and giving women a chance to fight back. Conversely, on our side, significant impacts from empowering women in this way. Firstly, they get their rights as citizens actually defended under the courts. Secondly, key deterrent, because men realise how horrible this suffering that they have inflicted is. That is the only way to break into the psyche of a man who would throw acid on the face of a woman who has committed an attack like this. It is the only way to break into that mental block, because you make them understand in their own terms, in the terms of that religion, what they are doing is not only wrong, but is immoral itself. We stand with these women who have been subjugated and subject to acid attacks for literally decades. We think this is the one chance to give them to fight back. I am so proud to propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister. That's the speech. Now, call upon the Leader of the Opposition to speak against the motion.
While we recognise you have a right to self-defence, we think this right has to be limited by the state to some extent in order to create outcomes, in order to create better criminal justice. We think that's important because of people's dignity, and that's important because otherwise this is an illegitimate thing for someone to do. Firstly, two bits of extraneous rebuttal. Firstly, this assertion that it's going to decrease the amount of times this is done. But actually, we say often it's incredibly hard to know who threw acid in your face. It happens because cars go by you very quickly. The acid is thrown, you've got no ability to react quickly. So it's often done by large groups of people, whether that be a family because of a family feud. There's often an incredible culture of silence where even if you know that that particular family persecuted you, you don't know who, as an individual, decided to throw the acid. We say that actually, we think that it's for entrenched family reasons that people do this, for cultural significance, they're probably still going to think this is something that's incredibly important to them to respect their identity and to respect their community. Secondly, we say that at the point at which this is a personal feud, which is definitely some of the times, we say that women are going to probably choose not to do this, right? We think it's almost impossible to continue to live in that community, almost impossible to continue to be a member of that society at the point at which you have to choose to disown your family, or have to choose to disown a large amount of your family. You're going to have huge amounts of coercive pressure in order not to make this decision. We think that actually that means that a lot of their benefits about reclaiming your identity fall out of the debate at the point at which they note the coercive pressure people are under. Two things in this speech. Firstly, why this is utterly illegitimate, and secondly, the impacts of this on the way people view Sharia law and the way people view Iran. So firstly, what sort of justification did we get out of opening government? They said, aha, people need to be re-empowered. I think people are re-empowered at the point at which they get like some form of justice, right? Even a criminal prosecution, or it's like an official body saying this happened to you is probably some form of re-empowerment. So they didn't explain A, why this was an exclusive form of re-empowerment, or either why that re-empowerment has to come in the version of approximating their suffering. The second thing they said was, the state uses you, and that's an incredibly problematic thing. But here's the thing to notice. Yes, you are the victim of this crime, but you are not the exclusive impact of that crime. It affects the way other people in the society act. It affects the way other people view their lives. It affects other people in that family. At the point at which it has impacts which impact other people in that state, the state is allowed to instrumentalize you in order to achieve wider criminal justice goals, because it also has a responsibility to other people who are living in the state. Okay, why do we think that this is illegitimate? Right? Because we think that although there is a right to self-defense, the state takes that right away from you and enacts punishment for certain reasons. Firstly, we say that this is just a mechanism for protection of people, and that's incredibly important, right? Because if you do this, you take away people's dignity, right? Like, the arbitrary problem that they tried to get away with is actually a massive one, right? Because there are no characteristics that you determined that says whether the woman is willing to apply that punishment for it. We say that actually that means that the state doesn't give you the dignity that you deserve. Secondly, we say that this is just too harsh a punishment, right? Like, there's a reason we have standards that prisons need to be acceptable as opposed to upland hellholes. There are reasons to do with people's personal dignity that we need to treat them with respect. We think that just because someone else has done something bad doesn't legitimize you undermining their dignity in the same way as well. Lastly, we say that the people who do this are often incredibly coercive structures, right? This is often an incredibly patriarchal society. The important thing here is that the Iranian state backs up that patriarchal society. The Iranian state enforces a certain amount of values, certain amount of cultural media, endorses certain ways of teaching in school, which make that state incredibly patriarchal. At the point at which the state was in some way complicit with the fact that they made that choice, the state is then not allowed to punish them, or not allowed to give the option to punish them to such a large degree. We think that coercive power of the state and the fact that it can change your attitudes is incredibly important. I'll take the closing.
So exactly what punishments do you think should be applied against these men?
We would probably like to see them in prison for an incredibly long amount of time. Okay, now let's now directly engage with the second part of my speech, where it talked about how this affects the way Sharia law works. Because they said, it will be really great when a Sharia law is seen to apply consistently. Maybe that's true, but that ignores the fundamental power dynamics within Iranian society, right? Because maybe it's true that they will be applied consistently, and the few times that women have the ability to harm men, that's important. But we say that in society, it's far more likely that men are going to use this coercive power in order to punish people who've committed adultery, a standard that exists for men and a standard that doesn't exist for women. It's going to be far more likely that this standard is used when the power dynamic is that men have the power and men are allowed to punish their wives, right? So we say that actually you reinforce a norm which is incredibly harsh to women and is incredibly bad. So what is the impact here, right? So firstly, let's point out the context of this, which is Iran is an incredibly important country in terms of the way people view Islamic laws, right? Because it's managed to have economic liberalization and progress while still having an incredibly orthodox value. There is a precarious balance of liberalism and secularism, and we think that the nature of Sharia law in Iran is actually very important to the nature of Sharia law in other places. We say it locks in an incredibly harsh, retributive form of that law. We say that actually at the point at which it is vindictive and harsh and almost exclusively, or vast majority of the time applied to minorities, that's incredibly bad. But secondly, it allows you to apply to minorities and women more, right? Because at the point at which a woman says it's unfair that you punish me for adultery, they can say, aha, actually Sharia law is equal, because if I threw acid in your face, you would be able to throw acid in my face back, right? That is a normative switch where men can justify the use of Sharia law towards their women and towards the wives who behave badly because they think it is a reciprocal thing. That's incredibly damaging because that lessens the ability for people to fight against the practice of Sharia. It lessens the ability to fight against something which we actually think is unfair for women to be treated like that. Lastly, we say that it becomes the image of Iran that you can get, right? It shows both liberals in Iran who think that this is wrong, who think it is horrible to torture someone by throwing acid in their face, that their country is not as liberal as they want. We say it empowers the orthodoxy within that regime. But secondly, it's also used in the West, right? Because Iran is probably the country which is closest to West values, but it still shows that their values are fundamentally incompatible, that they don't respect the dignity of people and the human rights of people, and are willing to punish them by throwing acid in their face. We see that massively reinforces a lot of very harmful narratives about the harshness of Islam that actually affects all Muslims by changing the way people view them, by changing the way people act towards them, by not thinking of them as liberal, and for actually just thinking Islam is different. That massively increases racism. We are very proud to oppose.
Ultimately, we are not just receptacles of utility. We think we're something more than that. That's why we value each and every individual person in our lives so much. That's why we value relationships so much. That's why we create goals that are meaningful to ourselves. But just the reason that these attacks on women aren't just another consequentialist harm that can be added up, but just the reason that this denial of their agency and their very assertion of self is so disgusting, we must, above all else, value their ability to reassert themselves in the face of this act which will define their lives. That was what government did not respond to. That is what wins this debate, regardless of whatever other consequentialist stuff that they want to talk about. Just for fun, I'm going to rebut that anyway quickly, and then go on to the rest of my speech. One, they said that women it might be bad for them, it might hurt their hurt them in their community. If they want to not do this and they decide that's something that they want to prioritize, fine. If they don't want to prioritize that, also fine. That's why we're empowering them. Secondly, just on lots of these generic backlash points, they are proposing quite a strict punishment for men, just determined by the state, which is putting them in prison, limiting their mobility for a long amount of time. Presumably, lots of their backlash harms apply. On this idea about changing the system, one, note that Iran is undemocratic effectively, so that's quite a hard thing to do. Two, note there's a lot of people already calling out this system, so we don't believe that's going to stop. Thirdly, we do not believe that it is obviously true that Islamic law is false and people can't decide to organize a community on this basis. What we said was, if you force someone to live under a system of law by a basic principle of reciprocity and fairness, you should allow them to apply that people to their mistreaters. Just as if a woman did something wrong, she would be subject to the Sharia principle of an eye for an eye in the Sharia courts. So, onto the principle, and just finally on this, they might not know who their attacker is. Just like you might commit a murder and you might not know who that is, that means you can't prosecute them. That's how prosecutions work. They know their attacker, this policy applies. If not, it would be harming an innocent person, and that's not acceptable. I'm going to talk about the difference between harming innocence and non-innocence. So, why is the right of this woman something incommensurate, something valuable, and something that you must take into account in deciding this debate above any other impact? because Annie explains that one, this is a denial of the woman's very ability to assert her identity in the most fundamental ways, when she's hit for the way she dresses, for the relationship she chooses, for the religious values she decides to hold herself to. But crucially, every day of her life, this scar is with her. Every person she meets sees her and says, I know what you went through. I know that your family thought you weren't worth expressing yourself, and they decided to hit you in this most terrible way. Why is this so disgusting and appalling? Because fundamentally we're social beings. The way we're able to value ourselves is often the way others perceive us. That can dominate our identity if we don't have something to cling to. Now everyone sees her as a victim. Everyone sees her as pathetic. Everyone sees her as someone who tried to assert herself and failed. What we give her is something to cling to. What we give her is that this is not an act that was completely out of her control. This was an act that she was able to define. She was able to define by responding it to anger. She was able to define by responding to it with forgiveness. Whichever she chose, she made that hers, and we believe that gives her some worth. It gives her some agency. It means every time someone looks at her and thinks she's a victim, she knows she was not completely passive. She knows she's not like a completely meaningless, pathetic being. She knows she was able to assert herself. Why is that so important? Because that feeling of worth is crucial for us to be able to ever get the confidence to do what we want to do. And fundamentally, that's what autonomy comes down to. That's what empowerment means. It means being able to express yourself, to have the confidence and worth to do what you want. And that's why we think it's so valuable, because we believe the individual decisions of people and their ability to express themselves is something unique and precious and can't be compared. The way I make decisions is not some simple determinate thing. It's something that's special to me. You might make different decisions. You might choose to live, to present yourself in different ways. That's fundamental to being a human, to being a self. We give her the worth to feel she can re-express that. We give her the worth to feel she's not always a passive victim. Yes?
Suppose someone shoots my sibling, and while shooting them back, I injure someone else through collateral damage. Do you think that collateral damage, that innocent person, is legitimate?
So, two things. One, we think this policy can be ensured without collateral damage. Two, we believe that there is, if there is minimal collateral damage, that is just a side effect, someone else sees it and feels a bit annoyed, that's not something we're willing to prioritize, just as we don't prioritize the collateral damage on homophobes when they get annoyed that someone gets prioritized for a hate crime. So, we believe that valuing this woman's right to reassert herself is the most important thing, because fundamentally her worth, her selfhood, giving her a sense of autonomy is something incommensurate, something precious, and something we can't throw away. They say, how come this means you can throw the acid back in their face? We say we would never let acid be thrown in the face of an innocent person deliberately for the reasons I just explained. But I think in the instance where someone has thrown that acid in their face first, there is a difference. What is this? With autonomy, for your decision to be meaningful, it has to be repercussions. I don't define myself by whether I brush my teeth on the left side first in the morning or on the right side, because it's meaningless. I define myself on how I treat people and how they're going to react to me. I define myself by the career I choose and the implications that's going to have to me. Fundamentally, for choices to be meaningful, you've got to be held account to some extent. And we believe that if someone says that it is an acceptable thing to do this to a person, they have chosen freely to decide that they should have that standard held also to themselves. They have said that's an acceptable thing to do, and by proxy, they effectively consent to this principle being violated in this case, and they say this can happen to them. We think by consistency, they've effectively said this is an acceptable thing to do to me. And when trading off the harm that happens to the woman's denial of agency versus their denial of agency, that is why in this case we are able to prioritize the woman. And that's why it's acceptable. So lots of people think determinism. If determinism is true, then all the reasons I just gave for why we value human autonomy and the specialness of you making your own decision don't exist. So just, if you value human autonomy, if you value the freedom of expression, then that means you probably don't really think determinism exists. Finally, note that they don't respond to Annie about how this is a particular way to stop these crimes and to stop further violations of a woman's selfhood. Why? Because often it's quite obvious if you get caught in an acid attack. It's quite a hard thing to avoid. Often these people know they'll get punished and feel their honour means that's a price they're willing to take. The only way to stop some of these crimes happening is not through even greater punishments, but by making them sympathise. The way to do that is when you're planning the acid attack, to know it might happen to you, to think, oh my God, wait, what if everyone saw me for the rest of my life and knew I had done that, I could not put a person through that. That would further empower women, that would free them from this denial of their agency I am so proud to propose.
Can we just be a bit quieter? The premise under which the opening government have to set this entire debate is that blinding someone, putting them through that trauma, that pain, defining them for the rest of their life is a fundamentally terrible thing to do to someone else. We think doing that as the state is also then a bad thing under this own logic, that these criminals still have some rights and some dignity, no matter how terrible a person they are, and we should not allow victims to have any say. Toby says, oh, they said it was all right. I don't think we should be taking the judgment on morality of criminals into account when deciding state policy. We have a duty to rise above that and hold ourselves to higher standards. Two things in this speech. Firstly, legitimacy. Secondly, the effects of this. So, all rebuttals integrated. So, the opening government stand up and go, these crimes are inherently an attack on your personhood, so they are a unique loss. Note that a large number of crimes are a fundamental attack on your personhood, like murder and those kind of things. They fundamentally attack you, and people's reactions are fundamentally different in each way. I'm not sure necessarily why this is so inherently wrong. They say it's because they scar you for life. So do many other forms of assault that can be observed. I'm not sure we are going about the state doing this. For example, if you get drunk and then, knock someone over and mean they can't walk again, I'm not sure why we aren't going to go about doing this to them. I'm not sure it is a fundamental thing to say that is acceptable. Because they also then say it's because it's the denial of their ability to assert themselves. Yes, women do get a choice. We don't necessarily think that does make them feel as empowered. No, there is incredible pressure here. And this is what Toby missed when Hannah pointed out there's going to be massive pressure from the community around you. Because irrespective of the decision you make, you're going to be harassed about this. Because you're making a decision fundamentally about Islam, about those kind of things that affect people within that community. You've already been seen as doing something about Islam and being problematic for your interactions with it. This makes it far worse. The harassment and feeling of panic and pressure on you is not necessarily a good thing. Some women may feel they have more power. Some may feel they're being put in a position where they're holding someone's entire ability to see in their hands, where the pressure is massive on them, where they don't know who they want to be after this. Just because some people will be better, there are a whole load of women who may hate this idea that they have any choice at all. I don't think that necessarily stands. They didn't prove it was an inherently good thing there. Thirdly, the reason they said this was good was because you have to approximate the exact same treatment. No, this is not necessarily true. An analogous case would be, for example, slavery. What do African Americans demand? They demand reparations. The thing is, money doesn't account to the exact same form of treatment you went through. Note why we use prison as a pretty universal system, because it doesn't approximate to exactly. Why is this? Because we deem certain behaviours fundamentally unacceptable, and we need to live and be bound by those rules within society. The state goes about setting up laws and saying these are fundamentally wrong. They must therefore be bound by those constraints to treat other people. Because yes, these are people who have broken the law. That doesn't mean you lose all right at any point. We don't see why, loads of people think you've got it. We'll deny them a trial too, because they deem that they could hurt someone else without a trial. I don't see why they lose their rights. Moreover, Hannah brought you some brilliant analysis on the fact they've often been coerced by society into having these views, and it's unfair to punish them. Note the whopping lack of response to that. Fourthly, the state is instrumentalizing your suffering. So note that a lot of their case was about, this is about the values of society that you are being locked out of and the community you are being locked out of. In that, they make you the concession that it's important to care about the effects on Islam and values under this, so we think that stands. But moreover, we can instrumentalise you to some way when you're having substantial effects on other people. Note that's what closing Ops POI was all about. Finally, it's not necessarily absolute. that we are instrumentalising you. We are giving you some form of return and punishment with prison. The thing is, we've got to balance that off against other rights and other things. Yes, we agree that women have absolutely been screwed over by this, but we don't think that takes that away. Moreover, Hannah points you all the analysis on why we deny victims the choice in terms of the arbitrary punishment for criminals and why that is wrong. We get no response that material stands within this principle society recognised generally. Before I go on to my second point, closing.
Yeah, so if everyone else in Iran is subject to the principles of Sharia law, including eye for an eye, why aren't men carry out acid attacks?
So, we think on this kind of ground that there is a fundamental issue in Iran where the interpretations of what Sharia law are open and up for debate. Because there are many interpretations, and this is why Hannah points out we're in a moment of absolute flux. The problem with this is, things must be applied consistently. That assumes that the law will stay as it is in perpetuum. We brought you a lot of reason in terms of the liberalisation in Iran that the nature of Sharia law will fundamentally change. This locks in a system of consistent application. You are right. Locking in consistent application is not an inherent good when that application fundamentally screws over women in all these other ways and denies them access to live in Iran and feel comfortable. That's why it's out of that. So, why do courts take on a burden to care for the rest of society, and why is that an important thing? Firstly, they are making a claim that they're not just enforcing the law, but they are enforcing Islam overall, that they are defining the interpretation of what Islam is and should be and how we should go about approaching that. Thing is, you then take burdens for defining what Islam looks like to other people and affecting that. You take on these externalities. Moreover, because you're an instrument of the state, you have duties to make sure the state is fair overall. What does that mean? You are fundamentally shifting and endorsing certain branches of Sharia law and interpretation. These are probably the most conservative elements within it. Note that a large number of Iranians are campaigning to change these kind of things because of the liberalisation and economic growth they're going with. What happens now is you tell all of these liberals that the West and the sort of newer values of liberalism is fundamentally incompatible. This is a retrograde step back to the worst forms, not necessarily my view, but in their view, of Islam, which are the most conservative. This means they feel they have no ability to cooperate or function within that society and change it. This leads to a large amount of them just leaving the country, and therefore you get the absolute rule of the most conservative elements within Iran. I'm not necessarily saying their views are inherently wrong, but I do believe the state and these institutions have a duty to make sure Sharia law is accessible for the most people. That is literally the prop case that they were trying to talk about there, that these laws are consistently applied and women have good access to them. When you lock in the worst types of Sharia law, you are making sure women don't have consistent application. We affect not just the women in these trials, but all women in Iran, and also just throughout anywhere else in the Shia world, given the importance of the Iranian system in that. I'm proud to oppose.
This debate is not about comparing Sharia law with a liberal Western system. This debate is about comparing the Sharia system without this law and the Sharia system with this law. Because what opening opposition missed is Iran isn't liberalising that fast. Women who steal things from shops will have their hands cut off under the principles of Sharia law. It treats them in this way. We're going to be the first team in this debate to know that these are not just women who are being attacked, these are Muslim women, and they want to be treated by the law as Muslim women. They don't want your Western standards of justice imposed on them, they want to be treated as equal under Sharia law, but equal as Muslim women. It's why we're going to bring you 2 points of extension. Firstly, I'm going to tell you this is principally legitimate because it treats women as men are treated under the system, and secondly, about changes in Sharia law. So firstly, on why this is principally legitimate. Oh, and the battle to opening opposition at the end. Opening Gov say, retribution is okay when things are really bad, and this is a terrible misogynist crime, and that's true. But I want to note a few things about Sharia law at the moment, because it advantages men in certain ways. Firstly, it is just patriarchal in the generality. The second thing is it treats men's testimony as worth more than a woman's. If you were a man in court and a woman testifying against that man, you treat the man as automatically correct unless you have more than 4 women testifying against him. It imposes stronger impositions on women for things they do within the family. So I want to note here that men are systematically advantaged by this system at the moment. And the important thing is they accept the rule of law as a result. They are advantaged by this rule of law in so many ways. What we are doing in this debate is just tilting that advantage back a little bit. We're treating women as men are treated under this law, and that is why it's fair. The second thing is I want to note, the vast majority of people in Iran support this. They are Muslims themselves. They aren't as openly opposite and suggesting closet liberals who are just pushing for a more liberal justice system. They want Sharia law, but most Muslim women want this Sharia law which treats them equally. Why is this important? Because what does this policy do? It treats women as full people, but it treats women as full people according to their Muslim identity. They want to be treated under Sharia law. They want the principles of Sharia law applied. What they want cut out is the misogynist element of Sharia law, which treats men as better than women. So look, when open opposition say, why don't we just use prison? This misunderstands this. Because in the West, we tend to value bodily autonomy as the most important thing because we live in a broadly secular society. What do people in Iran tend to value most? I realise I'm kind of making generalisations of people here, but you need to do that to talk about them as a society. In Iran, they tend to value sin in front of God. That is seen as the ultimate shame, or shame on your family because you have sinned in front of God. So prison misunderstands what these women want in these situations. Sending the guy to prison, sure, that's good under a Western conception of justice. It's not good under an Islamic conception of justice. These people hold this Islamic conception of justice, and this is why they want them punished in this way, because they're punished in the eyes of God. They're punished according to Sharia law, and that is what really matters to these people. It's really easy in debate the whole time to forget why religious people are, like how important those beliefs are to them, because we broadly debate in a secular paradigm. But it's really important in this debate that we don't forget how important these beliefs are to these people and how they guide their principles. Closing.
Just to be clear, given this debate doesn't take place assuming Sharia law is true, does it have any normative value, or is your argument purely that consequently it's good to do what people want when it comes to the justice system?
No, what I'm saying is as long as the system of Sharia law is present in Iran, this is a legitimate thing to do. And I will now respond to open opposition's point on this. Because open opposition say things are liberalising. I'm not sure how fast things are liberalising. They are liberalising a bit, but not that much. Sharia law is still applied in the vast majority of circumstances in Iran. What that means is that maybe in 50 years, when Sharia law has been abolished in Iran, you shouldn't treat men in this way. We would agree with that principle. But the difference is, if we're going to treat everyone else according to Sharia law, why don't you in this circumstance? The reason people are arguing against this in Iran, their arguments are not open opposition. They're not saying, we should have a liberal justice system. They're saying that women don't deserve these protections of Sharia law because they're worth less than men. What this does is it treats them as the same as men according to that Sharia law. They say this is a retrograde step. What I want to note is the first step in liberalising Sharia law should not be placed on women. It is not acceptable to say the first thing we will do when we liberalise Sharia law is we will not offer these protections to women, given they are already discriminated against under the current system. Why don't we take the burdens of Sharia law in terms of marital crimes off them as the first step to liberalising? It's incredibly perverse for open opposition to say this is the tool by which we should achieve this, given how badly women are discriminated against. As a result, because these are Muslim women, because this is why the principles of justice are important to them, that is why we should treat them in this way. Here's the second argument about changes in Sharia law. Because open opposition are right, there is slow liberalisation happening, although it will be a very long process, 50, 100 years, it's hard to predict. But the important thing here is President Rouhani, for example, has recently appointed female diplomats. So whilst Sharia law is very heavily entrenched in Iranian society, you can change the protection of women under that Sharia law. It's going to be impossible to get rid of Islamic conceptions of justice in a country which is a theocracy, but you can change elements of how people understand women within that society. And how you can do that, you can empower women to say Sharia law ought to treat us equally. Because if you do, as open opposition say, and you treat them as equal under a Western conception of law, that isn't treating them as equal in the theocracy of Iran, it's not treating them as equal within Islam. If you treat them as equal within Sharia law, if you treat them as equal under the rule of Islam, then that's a much more powerful statement, because it's saying you are equal under this religion. That is so important. Finally, responses to open opposition. They talk about the the dignity of people a lot. The thing I want to note is that our conceptions of dignity in the West and conceptions of dignity in Iran are very different. This is seen as a dignified principle. The reason it is seen as a dignified principle is because it comes from God. The idea of eye for an eye is one that is contained within the Quran. And why is that so important? Because this is seen by people as a dignified way to solve the problem. It's seen as a dignified way because it is according to the Prophet Muhammad and the instructions he received from God. So when they say the state sets up a patriarchy, it's exactly why you should treat people in this way, because it is dignified under this law. Then they have a whole lot of kind of met problems. Oh, you can't identify these people, you won't carry out. I wouldn't know. All of these apply to the protections they wanted to put. If you can't find these people, what do you do? In particular, they say women won't report this because people might get angry. If you're sending the guy to prison for 30 years, do you expect the family of that man not to get angry under their system? Of course they're going to get angry. I don't see why there's some unique anger in this. In fact, they're less likely to get angry when they're being treated under Islamic law rather than a strange imposition of Western law imposing on the Iranian system. They say that it's worse because women have to make this choice. I want to empower Muslim women to make the choice that they feel is right according to their religion. I think there's a way of empowering them and not a way of making their choice. Because this is a debate about treating these women as Muslim women, I am so proud to oppose.
Opening government started their case by claiming this restores agency to victims of these attacks. We will contest the very premise that agency exists at all and explain the implications of that. Secondly, to an extent it does exist, we will talk how about the outcomes will become much more worse in these very conservative communities and why we owe a big obligation to future victims. Before that, one point of rebuttal on Sharia law. Firstly, note, a tenet of all 5 schools of Sharia law, by the way, so it's not all the same, a tenet of all 5 schools of Sharia law is the fundamental equality of all individuals before God. That's why it was different, that's why it was introduced in Sultanite states. Why is this important? Because when victims can choose punishment, you invalidate that equality when one person can choose what kind of punishment you get. But secondly, we also point out, Michael points out in the POI, that is not a reason why Sharia law is good or correct. It might be legitimate. They are correct in pointing that out. But that does not make it optimal or the best. That's something they have to defend. Thirdly, I want to point out, they are correct that they generalize people. Some women who are victims of these attacks are genuinely religious. Others just want to have a good time. Others care about family. It is unclear to me why being Muslim is the primary part of their identity, and I don't understand consequently why CG's extension is so important in that regard. But also worth pointing out, there is a gradual change. There is a move in reformism under Hassan Rouhani. There are Facebook groups like Iranian Women Unveiled. There is already a gradual shift. They say this is the first step, but they provide no reason why there will be a second step towards gradual liberalization after this. On deterrence, firstly, when people do these crimes, they usually don't think about the punishment, they think they won't get caught. Secondly, if the argument was true, that countries with a death penalty would have lower rates of murders than ones that don't. Clearly not the case. Thirdly, to a point they will get punished, people think they are inflicting the punishment of God, i.e. their conception of what religion should look like. They're happy to accept a personal harm for them. But fourthly, if anything, the risk of you being disfigured by acid is probably a reason to be more harsh when punishing women in the future. So instead of disfiguring them with acid, possibly killing them or something worse. So I don't see why that is beneficial on opening government. On agency, why do we think there isn't such a thing as free will? Opening opposition point out that it is correct that people have social interaction, but we want to go further than this. We want to point out that things are either predetermined or they are not. What do I mean by this? Either everything is random and humans are a collection of particles which interact in a random fashion, in which case I have no influence over my decisions, or things are not random, in which case they are determined. If they are determined, that means that I again don't have an influence on how my decisions point out. The second thing I would add on this is a lot of people's views are shaped by genetics and the way they are born. So it is unclear to me a large degree of agency exists. Why is this important? Because that means the primary goal of the criminal justice system should not be retribution, because in many ways these perpetrators of these crimes were not influencing on the decisions they were made, but they should be to protect other individuals. That is why jail is an appropriate punishment, and that is why we support long jail sentences. But it also gets rid of opening government's claim that these women get their agency restored, because that is an assertion they had to prove. It might be good, but there is no agency restored because there is no agency to begin with. On outcomes, a very ESL part of the extension, there will be a backlash. Why is that so compared to jail? Firstly, it is just visceral, i.e. a lot of people find faces disfigured by acid horrible. That means that a lot of your immediate social circles, your friends, feel very bad about this. Secondly, this is permanent. Your face as a perpetrator will be disfigured by acid until the end of your life. Thirdly, why there is likely to be a backlash, this serves no protective purpose. The fact that a victim has disfigured the perpetrator's face with acid does not protect other people in society for it. Fourthly, and this is important, to an extent these individuals are likely to rehabilitate, assuming they have free will. That only happens when they have gradual interaction with society to begin with. Now, a disproportionately large amount of perpetrators of these crimes are men. A disproportionate amount of victims are women. That means every single time you see someone who is male and has a face that was disfigured by acid, you're unwilling to employ that individual, unwilling to engage in conversations with that individual, unwilling to have any contact with them at all. Why is that important? Because what that means is they get stuck in their same societies and their same communities, which made them do those crimes in the first place. That is awful. Secondly, this also, on the impacts, this also, to an extent these attacks are awful, increases blood feuds, especially in very conservative communities. Thirdly, we tell you that there will be a less of a degree of general sympathy with victims when the perpetrators were disfigured at all. So there is a likelihood of these attacks overall happening far more in the future. Why is that important, and why should that be prioritized over current victims before that opening?
If agency is meaningless, you have no reason for the incommensurate value of human life. Does that mean you publicly kill an innocent if the pleasure to the rest of the population outweighs the pain of death?
No, because they are basic rights in Sharia law, as I already pointed out. But with regards to the obligation to victims, I point out firstly that the point of reciprocity, which they make in their case, is that it is to mitigate harm. Why is this important? Because if future victims are harmed, i.e. if it is a result of my analysis, it is more likely to have future attacks, then you have future victims. Why are they more important? Because if the point of reciprocity is to mitigate existing harm by making it up or tipping the scales back to the victim, in a situation when there are future harms, then you need to mitigate those harms again. However, if you're likely to have less harms on our side of the house, there is no mitigation necessary to begin with. But to an extent, the goal of state policy should be utilitarian. At the moment, when you have more harm towards individuals, when you have more victims, then you have an overall larger amount of harms towards a lot of people. So what does this ultimately mean? This means that you have more attacks on their side of the house. Why is that? Why is that an issue? Fundamentally, so overall, we point out in our case that there is no such clear thing as agency. We have to hear reasons as to why that is true. This is not inherently harming Sharia law, but also, to an extent, there is agency. There are far worse outcomes on their side of the house because you have an overall increase in acid attacks I'm very proud to oppose.
Not applying that principle to acid attack victims cements the idea that it is not a real crime. Women who are blinded and impaired by these attacks are often deemed to have been behaving in un-Islamic ways. It is the only principally acceptable response is to reassert their Muslimness through the policy that Iran has pursued. 3 things in this speech. Sorry, actually only 2 things in this speech. First of all, is this an overly harsh punishment, looking at the principal legitimacy of it? Secondly, how does this affect the position of women? Before that, rebuttal to closing opposition. First of all, free will does not exist. I mean, incredibly bold of them to try and prove this in a 7-minute speech. Our understanding of consciousness and the way that the brain behaves, how genetics shapes the way that our neurons fire, is far from certain. Our understanding of the Newtonian universe and how its laws govern specific atomic reactions is incredibly contentious. They're never going to be able to prove this in this debate. If consequences, furthermore, are really all that matters in the system of justice, we believe from government the feelings of Muslim women should be treated with equal consideration in this consequential clash. Jamie explains to you why the feelings of these women fall on our side, not theirs. Secondly, in terms of backlash, look, any attempts to improve the position of women in Iran will have some level of backlash. That is not a reason for us not pursuing such policies. This forum, however, is a unique way to try and effect change that advantages women without trying to provoke the worst kind of backlash. It's not a legislative change, it is a legal one with a crucially Islamic basis. It is very difficult to say the application of eye for an eye in this principle case is contentious, because you are literally talking about an eye for an eye. We think the kind of moderate Iranians that we want on side are going to see this as a clearly Islamic step and not have the kind of backlash they talked about. Finally, in terms of the number of attacks increasing, look, Jamie talks to you about the broader cultural perceptions and knock-on effects you get by treating women with equal respect under Islamic law. Future women fall on our side of the debate, because as I'm going to go on to re-emphasise, we think got basically no response. You now get sympathy with women because they are treated with respect under Sharia law. That's why we win on those grounds. Firstly, is this an overly harsh punishment? Opening opposition ran an incredibly naive case about applying broadly Western standards of justice, no thank you, in terms of we would prefer in prison sentences, this is overly harsh. Jamie points out to you, given that we have to live with the reality of Sharia law in Iran, given that they cannot realistically take on the huge burden of saying that Iran will liberalise in an acceptable time frame for these women, given this is a country that in recent memory has rejected moderate secularism through a revolution, we think we have to take this debate on the ground that Sharia law is going to be implemented in Iran for a considerable period of time in the future. What does that mean? First of all, Jamie explains to you the ways in which Sharia law specifically advantages men. Given that they accept those advantages and live under those advantages, we do not think it's enough for opening opposition to say this punishment is cruel. Men live under a cruel system of punishment in general that typically tends to advantage them. We are tipping these scales of that advantage in a way that makes Sharia law more consistent. But second of all, Jamie is the first person to say to you that Muslim women living under Sharia law want to be treated under its principles. He goes further than opening government in telling you this is not just a question of retributive justice, it is a question of retributive justice that takes into account the identities of Muslim women. He's simply patronising and closing opposition to try and respond to this point by not treating these women as Islamic, by treating them as some un-Islamic agents that are hypothetical and abstract in this debate. These are real women that really subscribe to the kind of commandments handed down by Allah which should respect their preferences. Why is prison not an acceptable punishment for opening opposition to stand behind? Yeah, go ahead, actually.
Sharia law has many interpretations due to the very nature of this script. This is shaped by authorities like the court. Why do you want to guarantee and solidify this brand of Sharia law with consistency that you guys so support?
We think this is broadly the mainstream application of Sharia law in Iran. That's why I have stuff like the death penalty, no thank you. And we just think it has a lot of knock-on benefits. Why is prison not an acceptable punishment? Again, Jamie explains to you this is an incredibly relativistic judgment for them to stand behind something like imprisonment. The point is, in the West, with our individualistic culture, we see the restriction of bodily autonomy as a principally acceptable punishment. If I, as a woman, were subject to sexual assault, my rapist going to jail would, I believe, be some kind of cost for the harm they have done to me. It is worse for these men to feel like they have broken God's law and need God's principles applied to them in punishment. It is better for these women, in terms of getting retribution, to feel like that is something that has been applied. Given, as Jamie explains to you, these women subscribe to the very Sharia principles we're talking about in this debate, they want to be treated as Muslim women under this law. That is the only punishment that will be acceptable to them. Finally, on terms of is this an abhorrent punishment, government tell you this is just literally a horrific crime. The kind of physical mark that it leaves is particularly abhorrent. Opening opposition then say, if it's abhorrent, how can the state legitimately do this? They also seem to imply that because the state upholds patriarchy, the men shouldn't be accountable for their actions. Jamie explains to you when he talks about the way that men are advantaged, why it is that was a ludicrous principle for them to stand behind. Secondly, how does this affect the position of women? Jamie says it's important to note that Sharia codes in Iran do not treat women as equal in the eyes of God on a number of fronts. We think any steps that take into account that women should be treated as equal to men, it's just ludicrous for them to stand up and say Sharia law treats all people as equal. When Jamie literally says to you, the testimony of women counts for less than men. Steps that make women seem more equal to men in one of the most holy aspects of Islam, which is its legal codes, are important in terms of perception. What changes on our side of the house? Again, Jamie says to you, by making women a more full member of Sharia law, you probably can't get the kind of full legal change that they are advocating on their side of the house. We can get broader perception changes. The perceptions of women can improve. In terms of legitimising the aspects of Sharia law that now oppress women, opening opposition's big claim, no, these are often based on the fact that women are not being treated as equal. You think you're better able to challenge them when you make them more equal members of the cause. Finally, in terms of broader perception changes, we think it's really important that we make women seem like more equal part of Iranian society for the very reasons that when acid attacks seem like an un-Islamic crime, because the Islamic principles will be applied to it, it may be true on their side, you can't always catch the victims of those attacks. They are deterred by the broader cultural shift that they will be sinning if they do so. When closing opposition stand up and tell you, yes, these men believe they are doing God's work, that's exactly why imprisonment is not a punishment that will ever work on their side of the house. It is only telling these men that they have sinned against God that will give some chance of deterring them. Broadly, in terms of community shaming as well, we think communities are more likely to rally around women when they can't just say, you behaved un-Islamically and your attacker was right to do what you did, but rather say, your attacker was the one who behaved un-Islamically. You have the legitimate choice to apply an accepted principle of Sharia law in response to him. This is not an abhorrent punishment. Jamie tells you why it's exactly the kind of thing that Muslim women would want in this debate. And because it broadly improves the perception of women in Iran, as well as an added knock-on benefit, we are very proud to
You good? You good? Free will was one of the many things that Stefan spoke about, but it was unfortunately the only one that was responded to. Fortunately, there were a number more, and I will take great glee in summarising them now. Firstly, the shift in Islamic attitudes and understandings of Sharia law, how they disable that. Secondly, the revenge attacks and the increase in harm to future victims. Thirdly, what we care about from a principal perspective in this debate. Firstly, it's worth recognising that there are many different types of Sharia law, as opening opposition point out. However, Stefan highlights the central clash within that, between the idea that all people are equal, from the highest caliph to the lowest sinner, and the idea of an eye for an eye. Because if everyone is equal, then the sinner should not be punished in a way that you would not the caliph. However, on their side, an eye for an eye would say the opposite thing. In that struggle, they validate the latter course of interpretation. Why is this the case? Firstly, note the context, which is one of a widespread attitudinal shift amongst Iranians, as highlighted by the new power dynamics of the Iranian regime led by the more liberal Hassan Rouhani, as highlighted by the liberalisation of Iran more generally, the fact that it is opening up, the fact you can now get a visa there and they're meeting Muslims from many different countries, the fact there is a younger generation coming up that is more connected to social media and has a more moderate interpretation of Islam because they've not just been exposed to Iranian conservatives. Note, on their side of the house, they validate the eye for an eye interpretation of Islam. Why? Because they implement it. And this doesn't just apply to people who already believe it, because now it has the validation of the state justice system, which doesn't just appeal to small communities where they may implement this, but has a far broader impact. What I want to note here is, on their side of the house, they say, now deterrence is higher because you're being punished in the Muslim way. No. you still think that the woman is sinning. Now you just think that the way you responded is one which is valid and fair. So by punishing people in this way, all you do is you say the mechanism of punishment is a good one, which is what gets them doing the acid attack, but you don't in any sense rebut the central premise, which is that the woman is doing something wrong. Then they say, well, it deters people. Firstly, I think empirically this is very unlikely. But secondly, I think the exact opposite of true. You're actually more likely to do these sorts of things if you believe this is a legitimate means of punishing people. That is the message that they sent in a context where that message would be dying out. That is the clash that Stefan highlights to you that they do not respond to. Secondly, why does this lead to more revenge attacks? And look, on both sides, people are going to get punished. The question is why punishing them in this way is more likely to lead to repeat offence and revenge attacks than punishing them through prison. Stefan highlights 4 differences. Firstly, the sheer viscerality of it, which is a premise of the government case, I would note. The fact that you were disfigured for life, the fact that everyone in these communities, when they look at this person, will see the fact that their skin has been worn away and their bone is exposed. Secondly, the permanence of it. Putting someone in prison lasts for a finite amount of time, but the stigma of this remains permanently. Thirdly, the fact that it is just perceived as very cruel. The reason they are doing this to women is that they believe that the women have sinned. Within these communities, however, they do not believe that the guys in question have sinned. As a result, when they look at this, they will think of this as cruel and unusual discrimination. They say, oh no, they'll see both of them as equally. But that misses the point that this is perceived as a punishment for sin within these radical conservative communities. But the fourth thing to note is that you now tie it to the woman because it was her choice. She inflicted this upon you. It wasn't some impartial system. It was rather her discretionary choice to use this specific method of punishment. That means you are much more likely to do the following. Firstly, engage in revenge and reprisal attacks. Much more likely, incidentally, when you're not using a conception of preventative justice that locks these people up. Secondly, in many cases, these communities are more likely to feel under threat because of this more visceral method of punishment. That means they're more likely to turn inward and listen to the sorts of radical people who preach this hate. Thirdly, there's likely to be some degree of recursion because you see someone has done this to you, so you engage in a revenge attack in order to sate that blood. They say, no, this sates the deal, this evens the scales. No, because again, there's this basic asymmetry and they perceive the woman has sinned, whereas they do not perceive that they do. They simply perceive they were punishing sin appropriately, something you validate by punishing what you perceive to be sin in this manner. Fourthly, however, it's worth highlighting that these people find it much harder to integrate. So they're actually much more likely to engage in repeat attacks. They're much less likely to be reintegrated into a community that does not hold these sorts of values. All of this, note, takes place over A, many years, and B, not just over the perpetrator in question, over his friends, over his family, over his community, over his congregation at the mosque, all of whom may believe these things. Yes, maybe his probability of doing it is 5% higher, but that is true of the 20 people in that community as well over 20 years. So net, the probability of another attack is very likely. Why then, in the weighing mechanism of this debate, should that prospect of future harm matter more than reciprocity? First, closing.
Yeah, why should abused women be the ones to bear the brunt of your imagined liberalisation programme?
2 reasons, and I think that's a very uncharitable phrasing. First, because in many cases, the victim is another woman, right? Another woman who will be a victim of this abuse. It's unclear to me why you should prioritise mitigating the harm done to someone who already has been harmed versus preventing potential harm to someone who has not been harmed. It seems to me that reciprocity is simply a means of mitigation of something bad, but we'd still rather if that bad thing hadn't happened. In that scenario, why do you prioritise the present victim over the future victim when the harm to the future victim is far better? Because the best you can do for the present victim is partially mitigate, whereas the best you can do for the future victim is prevent altogether. 2 reasons then why we should care about preventing harm in this debate. Firstly, future victims matter more than present victims. As Stefan tells you, reciprocity is only a means of mitigating harm, right? The way we know this is we would still rather it hadn't happened in the first place. That means that this reciprocity necessarily doesn't even out the scale. Everyone's had enough autonomy, therefore it was fine, it was actually a net neutral thing. As a result, the most important thing is to prevent harm from happening to other victims, rather than just mitigating that harm to some extent for a recurrent one. On their side of the house, that is more likely to happen, and as such, we should try to prevent that by supporting our policy, which does not encourage this backlash for the 4 reasons Stefan gave you that differentiates this versus prison. But opening up government can see this. When they say in response to my POI, that's okay if there's only minimal or marginal collateral damage. Yes, our claim is that collateral damage is not marginal, therefore we invalidate your justification. Secondly, everything they said is premised on the idea that agency matters. They said you can't possibly prove it doesn't matter in 7 minutes. We didn't even try, guys, right? Why do you assume that free will matters? Why do you assume that agency matters? I know it's a pretty word and you can say it nicely. But that does not mean that it's necessarily important or has principal value. Stefan gives you 3 reasons why it might not. Crucially, even if you believe there is some doubt there, we should prioritise the thing that everyone in this debate agrees has value, namely the idea of harm and hurting people and pain. What are the responses we get to this? Well, why are you okay killing people? No, because just because you don't believe in agency doesn't mean you don't have a concept of rights necessarily. Then they say, well, don't people consent into this? No, not necessarily, because not everyone within this society will be religious. But secondly, you only consent into this if this is the system that you implement, right? We're saying we should not implement that system, and they don't consent into it because they don't believe that they have sinned. Look, at the end of this debate, we prevent harm to future victims. That is the most important thing. Proud to stand in opposition.